Today, when people think of Utah, they primarily think of two things. Obviously, the Mormon Church and its influence, but also politically speaking, they think of the Republican Party. It is one of the strongest Republican states in the country, both in terms of the presidential election and in terms of local offices. When John McCormick and I first started doing our research, we were interested in if that perception of Utah had always been the case. What we discovered is that no, Utah has not always been the bastion of republicanism that it is today. In fact, at one period during its history, it was very competitive politics. For us particularly, we were interested in whether or not a socialist, a leftist radical movement had existed in Utah, and we discovered in fact that it had. And that opened up some insights into Utah history. It went all the way back to the arrival of the Mormons here in Utah in 1847. The Mormons brought with them a kind of a utopian socialism. They called it the United Order, but it was very much a utopian socialist concept of everybody putting into the community what the community needed and taking from the community what each individual needed. So there's that radical communitarian heritage in Mormonism. And what we discovered is that there were political movements here in Utah, similar to political movements around the country, that drew on those communitarian traditions. And many of the people involved in them in Utah were Mormons. Many of the people involved in them in Utah were non-Mormons. But there was a kind of a fertile ground, at least for a period of time. After a while, the Mormon Church, in its desire to become more mainstream, begins to oppose and almost to forget that communitarian tradition. But there are still elements of it in the late 19th century when we began our research. During the late 19th century, the politics of Utah were very, very interesting and very, very complicated. On the one hand, the majority are attempting, under the pressure of the federal government, to do what they need to do to become a state. But during that same period of time, we find evidence of radical political movements, Populist Party emphasizing the question of free silver at the ratio of 16-1. The Populist Party is strong in Utah, partly because Utah is a silver state. Utah goes 80% for the Democratic candidate, William Jennings Bryan, in 1896. Even in its most Republican period in the last 40 years, it's not gone 80% for any presidential candidate. So you have a combination of the drive for statehood, along with the existence of people in Utah asking similar questions to what are being asked around the country about the excesses of wealth, the great gap between the very poor and the very wealthy, and how you bring about a more just and equitable society. In Utah, you have those same forces, the Populist Party, the Knights of Labor, and others. By 1900, as a socialist party is developed nationally, a socialist party develops in Utah as well. And for the next 20 years, it's very active in terms of elections and other kinds of activities. We'd like to say it creates a kind of an oppositional culture. And that culture is political, it's electoral, but it's also social. It's also intellectual. And so the Socialist Party places deep roots in Utah in those first 2 decades of the 20th century, which again are a very complicated period in Utah history, the years right after statehood. What happened is once the Socialist Party begins to gain ground in Utah, it is at the same time that the Mormon Church is trying to become much more mainstream and much more American in their nature. The socialists represent an alternative to that many leaders of the LDS Church don't appreciate. The irony is that in our research, what we have discovered that is in many ways Socialist Party of Utah is a lot like the Socialist Party elsewhere throughout the country in terms of its ideology, in terms of its composition, with one exception. Some 40% of the Socialist Party in Utah are LDS, many of whom are active and faithful members of the LDS Church. We like to tell the story that when we started doing our research and we found people with names like Wilfred Woodruff Freckleton and Joseph Smith Jessup and Parley Pratt Washburn, good Mormon names, we knew there was a Mormon element in the Socialist Party, a story that had never been told. And we believed that if we followed that story, it would help us not only understand socialism, but understand the various kinds of tendencies that Utah had exhibited in a crucial period of time. Well, the disparity between the two elements, the Mormon and the non-Mormon, took place at both levels. It took place generally in the politics of the time, but it took place within the socialist movement itself. There were a number of socialists who did not believe one could be a Mormon and really be a socialist. They believed that in the final analysis, that Mormon commitment to capitalism and to big business that was evidence in that period of time would trump any commitment they may have had to a kind of a communitarian heritage. There were other socialists who realized that because the Mormons were so dominant in Utah, it made sense that a certain percentage of any movement would be Mormon, but more importantly, it gave them a certain validity that they might not have gained any other way. So it was an uneasy relationship in many ways. And for Mormons who believed, we discovered one person who said it this way: Mormonism is my religious faith, socialism is my political faith, and saw no contradiction between those two elements. Many socialists couldn't believe that could happen, but it did. And it happened more often than not. Utah's role in this period of time nationally was complicated as well. Utah became a state in 1895. First election was 1896. In that election, as I think I mentioned, William Jennings Bryan carries the state overwhelmingly, running as the Democratic populist candidate. By 1900, Utah is solidly in the Republican camp. There is a political machine in Utah that is solidly Republican. The second generation of Mormon leaders are moving into the Republican Party, where the first generation had been states' rights Democrats. But because of the nature of Utah politics, because of the question of the attempt to deny a seat to a guy named Reed Smoot, who was a duly elected senator, but also an apostle in the LDS Church, Utah's role is minor in many ways, although the attention of the country is focused on these interesting questions. As that political machine continues, Utah becomes a kind of a safe Republican state. In 1912, for example, it is one of two states that the incumbent president, William Howard Taft, carries in that four-way election with Roosevelt, Wilson, and Debs. And he carries Utah in part because of the division, but in part because the Mormon Church is committed to regular republicanism. And that will continue really until, with some exceptions, until the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. And then Utah's politics are very balanced. From 1932 to 1952, Utah goes Democratic in every election, all four for Roosevelt, for Truman. After that, with the exception of Johnson in '64, it's been overwhelmingly Republican. Not as Republican as it is today, not in to that same degree, but it has been Republican post-war Utah. The shifting from Democrat to Republican and back was caused by more national trends than anything else, both in terms of the period of time when Utah was a competitive state where it was going for Roosevelt, where it was electing Democrats to the Senate and the Congress. It was part of a national pattern. After World War II, as the politics of the United States become more conservative, the politics of Utah become more conservative. Still competitive, really competitive until the 1970s, but that's part of it. What is also part of it is that for many Utahns, the emergence of some people in national government, Ezra Taft Benson would be one, who was Secretary of Agriculture under Dwight Eisenhower. It gave for many Utahns, particularly Mormon Utahns, the sense that Mormonism had finally been accepted and was really part of the American mainstream. And many Mormons in Utah sought to maintain that mainstream nature. So there's a lot of factors going on, some national, some local, some involving personalities. But it's a different history since World War II than it was before. People often ask, why is Utah such a strong Republican state today? I think it's a combination of a couple of things. I think Utah's politics in the last 40 years have tended to be more conservative than the country, though the country has moved in a conservative direction. I think the influence of the LDS Church, particularly on social and moral issues, has been pronounced. That has moved the state toward a more conservative position. The opposition of the LDS Church to the Equal Rights Amendment of the 1980s was a galvanizing event as well. So I think it's a convergence of forces within a generally more conservative America in the age of Reagan than it was before. I think that's a good question that historians of the future, when they get a little perspective on it, are going to want to ask and see if they can come up with an answer. But it is clearly something that is happening around us. Many times when people say to me, you study socialism in Utah and you've written a book on it, and I say yes, they say it must be a very thin book. And I say, no, actually it's a very thick book, and there is a really strong radical tradition. Most Utahns are unaware of that. Many of the families of the people who are involved in the radical movements themselves are unaware that their ancestors were involved in radical politics. And when we tell the story of the fact that in Utah between 1900 and 1923, some 100 individuals were elected to office everywhere from the city level to the state legislature saying, elect us and we will overthrow the capitalist system. That comes as a surprise. Now those people were elected, they didn't overthrow the capitalist system, they couldn't, and really in many ways they became what we call respectable reformers who wanted to prove that in office socialists could be just as dependable, just as honest, just as maybe more honest than could politicians from the Democratic or Republican Party. But there is a legacy there. It's a legacy that's had its ups and downs. The Socialist Party in Utah really, like the Socialist Party in the United States, declines in the 20s, reemerges a bit in the 1930s, is then kind of consumed by the New Deal here and around the country, reemerges again in the 1960s. Not so much the Socialist Party, but certainly a political left reemerges in Utah in that period of time. And so, you know, I don't know what the future holds. But the existence of a radical tradition makes it more possible for people to say, I believe, our preconceptions of Utah don't always match the reality of what really happened in the past.